everyone. Here we are in Annotation, the second edition organized by the New Center for Research and Practice. Today we are talking to Ingo, Arend, the critic. Can you tell us what have you seen so far in the Biennale? What do you think about the curated show, about the pavilion?
Well, thank you for the invitation for the interview. I'm back in Venice after 3 years of pandemic, and everyone was socially distanced. And I'm always a little bit skeptical about Venice because I don't like it as a city, because it's a kind of ritual walking into a corpse, stuffed with monetary things. No one is living here, only tourists, 16,000 people living here, 1 million tourists trampling through this open corpse every day. So for me, it's always a little bit morbid situation, and I'm not really sure whether this city is the right place for the art. But in a way, after 3 years where we are all distancing and trying to, have this kind of inner reflection or whatever, it was good to be back on the scene and have talks with a lot of people, and also seeing this kind of ritual, which I in a way dislike, happening again. So that was my first surprise that I like to be here. When I decided to go here, I was not really enjoyed by the expectation to be back here. But as I now practice it, it's okay. Well, you have always to make the distinction between the giardini, because they are separately curated and have nothing to do with the main show. I'm not completely overwhelmed, but by what I have seen so far, I mean, there have been shows which use this usual show effect, like the Danish pavilion, where they lay out a kind of dystopic scenery of mankind, post-human mankind. But it reminds me a little bit of the show Arend and Critic did some years ago, where they refurbished the whole Danish pavilion into a collector's place, also with death involved, the death of a collector it was, and he was swimming in the pool. So it was the same kind of show effect, trying to exploit this kind of dystopian theme we have now in the arts, but also in politics. I mean, we have the war, we have the ecocide, we have the genocide everywhere. So there is a kind of dystopic atmosphere at the moment, but they try to exploit this idea on a very in a manner where they use show effect instead of real rigid aesthetic strategies. So that's one example which I did not like. As a German, of course, I have to, as a German critic, I have to have an opinion on the German pavilion, which was done by a very well-known German artist called Maria Eichhorn. She's always pursuing artistic research. In the last documenta in Athens, she created a thing about gentrification in the city on the example of one certain house, and she researched the history of this thing. And in a way, she repeated what we know she was doing. And unfortunately, I found it boring because in a way, it showed the world that German artists or Germans perhaps in general are dealing always with their self, with their identity, instead of giving some aesthetic values which we have not experienced before. So, but it's of course a problem of the pavilion. It was constructed by the Nazis in the late 1930s of the last century, and everyone has to struggle with this building. Sometimes people survive and can present something which is not infected by this history, and sometimes it's not. And unfortunately, Maria Eichhorn well, is a little bit was struck by this hurdle in a way, always to refer to the history of the building and what is connected with it. Well,
Thank you so much for that. And I know that you mentioned somehow the dystopic moment and added to that the pandemic. Now, and we were talking about the venues of like Biennale and generally the organizations and spaces. And what do you think is the role of governmental and non-governmental organizations, and generally how they can somehow make themselves again relevant with the pandemic, with the new situation in the world in general, with the even added to that the NFTs, this new circulation of the art market. Do you have any take on that? How can they somehow maybe revitalize again the artwork, or how the artworks function? Maybe.
Well, I'm not a prophet. I think there's an urgent desire to experience art again, and so probably for a period of time, perhaps there could be a collaboration between all those people who want to show art, also with commercial institutions which they disliked before, because now we all have to work together in a way to restructure and to rebuild what was laid in a way in ruins in these 3 years of pandemic. I mean, museums were not really destroyed, but they were dysfunctioned. Also, a lot of art spaces, which always work on a precarious basis, have to rethink how they can do their work. And perhaps there is a short moment of collaboration between those institutions which kept distance, because there's on the monetary side, there's the commercial side, and the mostly precarious, non-commercial and anti-establishment art space and independent scene. And well, we have to see how this will work out. But I think they need a moment where a lot of people are eager and hungry for new art, which is my experience when I walked these through 2 days here over the fields, over the Giardini and the Arsenale, that there is really a hunger for people to experience some new things.
You were mentioning this, maybe we can call it gestural aesthetic with the posthumanism, and added to that is the surrealism and bringing together these two. What do you think generally about this theme, surrealism? Is it a relevant thing that is like resurfacing? Does it have anything to offer still? Or can it be somehow reformulated in a new way that can still be somehow used?
In general, I'm very skeptical about biennials who are working with historical references. So I don't like to go biennials who, try to give a lecture from a history book. And that's not the idea of biennial. The idea of biennial is to present something brand new, either in terms of the artworks, which no one has seen before, or in terms of aesthetic perspective. And so surrealism is not really a contemporary perspective, but I understand that perhaps after this kind of 3 crises, which I mentioned before, which we are experiencing now, perhaps people are getting back to this kind of subconscious, which is the main theme of the surrealism, because they have the idea that enlightenment or rational thinking has failed because it has led to the war and this situation the world is in now. But so I don't think the main show by Cecilia Alemani, which is referring to surrealism, has really brand new offers. But I was skeptical, but I liked most of the things she presented. So it perhaps was in a way superfluous to make this kind of categorization, the cyborg and all these things. she should have done a constant flow of positions without intermitting with these titles of the 5 chapters, or what it was. I forgot how many it was, 5 chapters or something like that. And what I liked was that I have seen a lot of positions which I've never experienced before. A lot of positions who were dealing with techniques very distant from our normal understanding of modernity, because they used folkloristic techniques, they used clay carpets, weavery and things like that, and tried to establish these perspectives and these kind of techniques as equivalent to this kind of abstract modernism, which we have experienced in all the also the conceptual side of the modernism, and also the Cecilia Armani included a lot of positions from indigenous artists, Sami artists, for example, but also from other parts of the world who were excluded from the artistic field in a way. Of course, it has changed a little bit in the last years, but now they are in the show, and I have seen not one of the big names of the kind of Western, Northwestern kind of NATO art, you know. It's not included in that. I mean, I've experienced the Venice Biennial done by Rocco Invesor some years ago when he was still alive, and for example, he included such a ridiculous painter like Baselitz in this thing. No one would have expected it because something had something to do with his directorship in Munich, or I don't know. So even he made this kind of references to all those self-declared great names of the Western modernity, and Cecilia Armani did not do that. And that's the main thing I very much liked. So I felt a lot of new energies, perhaps a little bit anti-rationalistic, and I'm not sure whether they could help the world get out of the mess we are in terms of aesthetic thinking or in terms of I don't know, political impulses. But I liked to be confronted with these positions. And it's interesting that this kind of very obvious political art was not involved. The only thing I've seen so far was the Peruvian pavilion with a guy named Rodriguez or something like that, and he was from the 80s, the Shining Path rebellion in Peru erupted, and he made kind of activist and propaganda, left-wing propaganda art for structural violence and police violence and things like that. So this was the only position. And in the last year we have experienced a kind of, I don't know, abundance of this kind of political positions, which normally functions like, well, I hold a banner or a billboard or something like that. And it's interesting that the whole biennial, though it happens in wartime, and we should have reason to protest against what is going outside, does not do that. And I found this positive.
Thank you. That was really interesting, and thank you for joining us.